Hello and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious, unbelievable that these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. This podcast is available on all of the major platforms. Just search for The Mysteries of History and you'll find us. Be sure to check out the website, themysteriesofhistory.com, where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes. And you can also find us on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for the M of H. We're on Facebook as well as The Mysteries of History. And you can access the links to all of our social media platforms via our website. And it's on social media where we post teaser videos to our podcast episodes, as well as sharing all the mysterious historical stories and content that we come across. So it's well worth checking out. So now, let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. In the late 16th century, the eastern coast of North America was, to Europeans, a place of promise and peril. A vast, largely unknown land, hovering at the edge of the known world. Forests stretched endlessly, rivers cut deep into the land, and the indigenous nations had lived there for generations, shaping the environment in ways Europeans barely understood. Into this uncertain landscape sailed English colonists, carrying dreams of wealth, power, and permanence. Among them was a group whose fate would become one of history's most haunting mysteries, the settlers of the Roanoke colony. When their governor John White returned to Roanoke Island in 1590 after a long and difficult voyage back to England, he found the settlement completely abandoned. No bodies, no signs of battle, no clear explanation. Just a single eerie word carved into a wooden post. That word was croatoan, spelt C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N. More than 400 years later, the disappearance of the Roanoke colony remains unsolved. What happened to the men, women and children who vanished from England's first permanent attempt to settle North America? Were they killed? Did they starve? Did they leave and blend into indigenous communities? Or did something else entirely occur? The story of Roanoke is not just a mystery, it's a tale of ambition, fear, cultural misunderstanding, and survival at the limits of human endurance. To understand Roanoke, we must first understand England in the late 1500s. At the time, Spain was the dominant European power in the Americas. Spanish ships carried gold and silver from the New World, enriching the Spanish crown and funding vast armies and fleets. England, ruled by Queen Elizabeth I, was eager to challenge Spain's dominance and claim a share of overseas wealth. Colonisation served several goals at once: expanding England's political power, establishing military bases against Spanish ships, gaining access to new resources, and spreading English influence and Christianity. But colonisation was expensive and risky. Ships were slow, storms were deadly, and supplies could spoil or run out. Any colony planted across the Atlantic would need to survive largely on its own. Still, the dream was irresistible. Enter Sir Walter Raleigh, a wealthy and ambitious courtier favoured by Queen Elizabeth I. In 1584, he received a royal charter granting him permission to explore and settle land in North America. Raleigh never personally went to Roanoke, but he organised expeditions and funded settlements. That same year, English explorers surveyed the coast of what is now North Carolina and returned with glowing reports of fertile land and friendly indigenous peoples. Encouraged, Raleigh sponsored England's first attempt at a permanent colony in 1585. The first group of settlers, mostly soldiers and craftsmen, arrived on Roanoke Island under the leadership of Ralph Lane. Relations with local indigenous tribes were tense from the start. Cultural misunderstandings, competition for food, and mistrust escalated into violence. Food shortages soon followed. The colonists had not prepared well for farming in a new environment, and they relied heavily on indigenous people for supplies. After less than a year, the colony failed. When English ships passed by in 1586, the settlers abandoned Roanoke and returned to England. This should have been a warning. Instead, it became a lesson ignored. In 1587, Raleigh tried again. This time, the plan was more ambitious and more fragile. Unlike the first attempt, this group included women, children, and families. The goal was not a military outpost, but a true English town in the New World. The colony was led by John White, an artist and mapmaker who had travelled to the region before. Among the settlers was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, Ananias Dare. Soon after arriving, Eleanor gave birth to a baby girl, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America. The colony settled once again on Roanoke Island, despite earlier problems, and immediately faced familiar challenges: limited food, strained relations with the indigenous peoples, and isolation. As conditions worsened, the settlers urged Governor White to return to England to gather supplies. Though reluctant to leave his family behind, White agreed. He sailed in late 1587, expecting to return quickly. But history intervened. In 1588, England faced one of its greatest threats, the Spanish Armada. Spain launched a massive fleet aimed at invading England. Every available ship and sailor was needed for defence. In the late 16th century, the Atlantic Ocean was more than a body of water. It was a battleground. Across its waves, two European powers, England and Spain, competed fiercely for control of the New World. Their rivalry was not only about land, but about power, religion, wealth, and the future of global influence. By the 1500s, Spain had built a vast overseas empire, while England was only beginning to dream of one. What followed was a tense and dangerous struggle that shaped the course of American and world history. Spain entered the race for the New World decades before England. After Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492, Spain quickly claimed enormous territories in the Caribbean, Central America and South America. Spanish conquistadors conquered powerful empires such as the Aztecs and the Inca, gaining access to massive amounts of gold and silver. This wealth transformed Spain into the most powerful nation in Europe. Spanish treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic loaded with precious metals, funding armies, palaces, and wars. By the mid-1500s, Spain controlled much of the New World and considered it rightfully theirs. Spain's dominance was also supported by religion. As a strongly Catholic nation, Spain believed it was a divine mission to spread Christianity to indigenous people. The Spanish crown worked closely with the Catholic Church, establishing missions and converting millions, often through force. To England, Spain appeared nearly unstoppable, but also deeply threatening. England arrived late to New World exploration, but its ambitions were no smaller. Under Queen Elizabeth I, England sought to challenge Spain's power and avoid being left behind. England was Protestant, while Spain was Catholic, and religious tensions fueled their rivalry. Unlike Spain, England lacked vast wealth and armies. Instead, it relied on private investors, explorers, and seafarers. Rather than conquering large empires, England focused on exploration, trade, establishing colonies, and disrupting Spanish control. England's strategy was risky but creative. If it could not outmatch Spain directly, it could weaken Spain in other ways. One of England's most effective tools against Spain was privateering, a form of legalised piracy. Queen Elizabeth I quietly authorised English sailors to attack Spanish ships and settlements, as long as they shared the profits with the Crown. Figures like Sir Francis Drake became national heroes in England and criminals in Spain. Drake's raid on Spanish treasure ships were daring and devastating. In one voyage he captured enormous amounts of silver and gold, embarrassing Spain but enriching England's coffers. To Spain, these English sailors were pirates. To the English, they were patriots. This constant harassment weakened Spanish control of the seas and demonstrated that Spain was not invincible. Spain focused its colonisation efforts in Central and South America, where wealth was greatest. England, seeing fewer Spanish settlements in the north, targeted the eastern coast of North America. English leaders hoped to establish colonies as bases for trade, create safe harbours for privateers, and expand England's influence. Early attempts, such as the Roanoke colony, showed how difficult this goal was. England lacked experience, supply lines were fragile, and relations with indigenous people were often strained. Still, these efforts alarmed Spain. Spanish leaders feared that English colonies could threaten treasure routes and encourage rebellion among indigenous populations. Religion deepened the conflict. Spain viewed Protestant England as a heretical threat to Catholic dominance. England, meanwhile, feared Spanish attempts to restore Catholic rule. Spain supported plots against Elizabeth I, while England backed Protestant causes across Europe. The New World became another front in this religious struggle, with both sides claiming moral superiority. Colonies were not just settlements, they were statements of faith and power. The rivalry reached its peak in 1588 when Spain launched the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet intended to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth I. The plan, though, failed spectacularly. English ships were faster and more manoeuvrable, and storms scattered the armada. Spain lost many ships and thousands of sailors. While Spain remained powerful, its aura of invincibility was shattered. For England, the victory was transformative. It boosted national confidence and opened the door to greater overseas ambitions. And so back to Governor White. With the intervening years interrupted by the Spanish Armada, it is no wonder that it took him 3 years to return to Roanoke Island. But what he found would haunt him and would turn a story of simple settlement into one of myth and legend and unexplained events. For Governor White found that the settlement of Roanoke was deserted. Homes had been dismantled rather than destroyed. There was no sign of struggle, no burning buildings, no bodies. This suggested something crucial. The colonists had left deliberately. White searched desperately for any clues. Then he found it. Carved into a wooden post was the word croatoan. On a nearby tree, the letters C-R-O were etched. Before White left in 1587, the settlers had agreed on a signal. If they left voluntarily, they would carve the name of the destination. If, however, they were in danger, they would carve a Maltese cross. However, there was no cross found, no etched mark to suggest danger was afoot. The word croatoan was the name of a nearby island, modern-day Hatteras Island. It was also the name of a friendly indigenous group of people, and this suggested hope. Perhaps the colonists had relocated, but White never followed the clue. Fate would intervene. A storm damaged his ships, supplies were running low, and his crew refused to continue with the search. Reluctantly, he returned to England, never ever seeing his family again. Over the centuries, historians, archaeologists, and storytellers have proposed many explanations for the fate of the Roanoke colonists. While no single theory has ever been proven, several stand out as the most plausible. The most widely accepted theory is that the colonists joined or were absorbed by indigenous tribes, particularly the Croatian. Evidence supporting this idea includes the fact that the lack of violence was evident at the settlement. It would appear that the people left willingly rather than under any duress. The Croatians' known friendliness towards the English was well known, so integration is plausible. And most interestingly, reports from later settlers to the region described indigenous peoples seemingly with European features. This does seem to suggest that the settlers did indeed integrate with the local population. Archaeological finds on Hatteras Island also include European-style tools and weapons and pottery. Again, this suggests prolonged contact or integration with the local tribe. For struggling colonists low on supplies, joining a knowledgeable and friendly local community may have been the smartest option for survival. Another possibility is that food shortages forced the colonists to move inland, searching for better resources. However, inland tribes were often more hostile to English settlers. If the colonists attempted to settle amongst them, conflict or slow starvation could have followed. This theory explains why no trace of the colony was found on Roanoke itself, but it raises questions as to why no large archaeological evidence has been found elsewhere. A third theory that emerged from early accounts suggests that the colonists were killed by hostile tribes. However, there's been no evidence of a violent struggle at all, and buildings were carefully dismantled at the settlement. There was no evidence that would suggest attack or burning of wood, something you would expect if the settlement was attacked by hostile forces. Finally, a fourth theory puts the blame firmly with the Spanish. Spain was aware of English settlements along the northeast coast of America and considered them threatening. Some believe Spanish forces destroyed the colony, yet Spanish records, usually detailed, contain no confirmation of such an attack. And as we've just mentioned, there is no evidence of foul play at the site itself, no burning buildings. As we well know, as new scientific evidence comes to light, the narrative of an historical event never stands still. And as it happens, recent research carried out in America at the site on Hatteras Island has possibly solved this mystery once and for all. For the past decade, Mark Horton, an archaeology professor at the Royal Agricultural University in England, has been working alongside the Croatian Archaeological Society, and they have found some really interesting bits of evidence which they think can put this story to bed once and for all. Horton goes on to say that they've uncovered proof that the colonists indeed assimilated into Croatian society thanks to the presence of a rubbish tip, or in archaeological terms, a midden. So a midden is really useful to archaeologists because it can tell you a lot about the population that created the rubbish heap in the first place. It's typically where people threw their food waste, broken pottery, cooking implements, possibly even things like weaponry. And like I say, it'll give you a snapshot into the life of the local society and population. And in this case, on Hatteras Island, Mark Horton and his team were looking at the rubbish tips, the middens, of the local Native American tribe that were living there on Hatteras Island. And this Native American tribe were known as the Croatian tribe, and also actually referred to as the Hatteras people. The assumption by Horton and his team is that they believed that the Roanoke colony were quite quickly assimilated into the local tribe. And they say that they have found irrefutable evidence that demonstrates that the English people, the Roanoke colony, were living with the Hatteras tribe, the Croatian tribe. And they put this evidence down to something called hammer scale. And hammer scale are tiny, flaky bits of iron that come, importantly, from the forging of iron. And as Mark Horton says, he believes this is definitive proof of ironworking on Hatteras Island, because he says that only the English colonists knew how to forge iron. And hammer scale is evidence of ironworking because hammer scale is what comes off a blacksmith's forge. So to quickly summarize, we have evidence of hammer scale, tiny flaky bits of iron coming from the forging of iron, which only the English colonists had the technological knowledge to produce. Yet hammer scale is present in the middens, the rubbish tips, of the Native American tribe, the Croatian tribe. So importantly, it's really good evidence to show that the Roanoke colony must have been working within the community of the Croatian tribe. the Hatteras people. An obvious counter-argument to make to this evidence that's been suggested or demonstrated by Horton is to say that what about if the hammerscale, the tiny flakes of iron, were deposited long after the Roanoke colony was abandoned, and perhaps it was deposited by communities much, much later, hundreds of years later than the Roanoke colony. Well, Mark Horton said that this is quite unlikely, and the reason he can say that with some conviction is that they found the fragments of hammerscale stratified. So in archaeology, when you're looking for dating evidence, if you can find bits of pottery or bits of iron in this case below other bits of datable evidence, you can say with a high level of conviction that the datable evidence that you have found lower down in the ground or further down in the soil is older than the datable evidence that you have deemed to be of a younger age that is higher up in the soil. This is what's called stratification. It exists as a principle to date sites in archaeology, but of course in the world of geology, which is where I come from, stratification is how you date rock formations, and you can use fossils is a really good example of how you can date different layers of rock by dating the fossils. If you know that a particular fossil comes from a time period and you can see where it's positioned within the layers of rock, you can tell which bit of rock is younger or older. So that's what Mark Horton has used here to determine that the hammerscale has come from the right time period. And more specifically, he says that they found the hammerscale underneath layers that they know date to the late 16th or early 17th century. So the hammerscale that they found comes from the right time period for when the colonists were lost. Mark Horton and the Croatian Archaeological Society say that they also found other artefacts on Hatteras Island, including flintlock guns, nautical fittings from ships, small cannonballs, an engraved slate and a stylus, which is a type of pen, in addition to wine glasses and beads. And this really adds to the picture of 17th century life on Hatteras Island. These were goods that the colonists brought with them from the ships, and became part of the way of life for them as they assimilated with the local Croatian tribe. In an interview with Fox News Digital, Mark Horton was asked if the colonists would have carried on living in harmony with the Croatian tribe, or were they perhaps killed off in a later war? And Horton replies by saying that he thinks they survived and successfully assimilated with the Croatian people. And he cites one piece of evidence from the 1700s, a documentary piece of evidence, which describes people with blue or grey eyes who could remember people who used to be able to read from books. And it also says that there was this ghost ship that was sent out by a man called Raleigh. We can draw the conclusion there that they are referring to Sir Walter Raleigh. So it's almost as if the story of the colonists has become part of the folklore of the or for the descendants of the original colonists. And Mark Horton finally says that he believes that, or his team as well believe, that the community, the original Roanoke community, indeed assimilated with the Native American tribe and their community, and that their sons, their descendants, sons, granddaughters, grandsons, carried on living on Hatteras Island right up until the early 18th century. And so it may well appear that this mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke is finally solved, And indeed, Mark Horton was asked if he believes that this is the case, and he obviously cites that the archaeological evidence, the scientific evidence, is pretty compelling, but he does say that more research needs to be done. And it's true, and he says people love mysteries. It's people like the mystery to go on, so there will be those people that will want this story to go on, and in some people's eyes, there's another reason that this community was lost. Perhaps one of the theories that I spoke about earlier is something that's more favourable to them. But, and this is an important but, you've always got to go with the scientific evidence, and the scientific evidence here is truly quite compelling. Of course, after the story of Roanoke, the English and Europeans returned to America many times. In 1607, 104 English settlers arrived in what is now modern-day Virginia, and they named their settlement Jamestown after King James I of England. The location they chose, though, couldn't have been worse. It was swampy land, mosquitoes carried malaria, and brackish water made people sick. And worst of all, most of the settlers weren't farmers at all. They were gentlemen, gold seekers and adventurers who expected riches quickly, not manual labour and work. Within months people were dying, and the settlement would not have survived if it wasn't for the Powhatan Confederacy. This was a powerful network of indigenous nations controlling the region. At first they traded food with the English, and without this support Jamestown would have surely vanished. And yet survival did not mean peace. No story from early America is more famous or more misunderstood than that of John Smith and Pocahontas. According to Smith, he was captured by the Powhatan people and saved from execution by Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter. It's a dramatic tale. It's also probably not true. Historians now believe Smith misunderstood a ritual adoption ceremony, not an execution. Pocahontas was likely around 10 or 11 years old, not a romantic figure, but a political symbol. Later she was taken hostage by the English, converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, and married colonist John Rolfe. Her marriage brought temporary peace. Her death in England in 1617, though, ended it. Jamestown survived, but at a cost. Jamestown was not a profitable town, but this was all to change. One plant changed everything: tobacco. John Rolfe discovered a strain Europeans loved, and suddenly Virginia became valuable. Land was cleared, indigenous territories were seized, and labour became the central problem. At first, English colonists relied on indentured servants, poor Europeans who worked for years in exchange for passage to America. But that wasn't enough. So in 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia carrying a new cargo, a new people, Africans. They were not initially labelled slaves, but that changed quickly. Over time, the colonies would build an economy rooted in racial slavery, transforming America forever. While Virginia grew in the south, something different was happening in the north. In 1620, the ship, the Mayflower, arrived off the coast of present-day Massachusetts. It had been on a long voyage from the coastal city of Plymouth in England, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. These settlers weren't after profit. They were Puritans, religious dissenters fleeing persecution in England. They wanted to build a city upon a hill, a society that would please God. They called it Plymouth. Like Jamestown, they all nearly died. And again, survival depended on indigenous knowledge. The Wampanoag people taught the settlers how to grow corn, hunt, and survive the harsh winters. One Wampanoag man, Squanto, spoke English, which he had learned during earlier encounters with Europeans who had enslaved him. The first Thanksgiving wasn't a myth, but it wasn't a fairy tale either. As more English settlers arrived, land became the central conflict. The Puritans believed land was unused if it wasn't farmed. Indigenous people believed land was shared, seasonal, and sacred. These worldviews could not coexist. By the 1630s, violence erupted. The Pequot War was one of the first large-scale conflicts between English colonists and indigenous nations. Entire villages were burned. Men, women and children were killed. The English celebrated it as a victory. Indigenous communities remembered it as a massacre. This pattern repeated across America. Colonisation was not peaceful expansion. It was displacement. By the late 1600s, America wasn't just English. The French controlled Canada and the Mississippi River. The Spanish dominated Florida and the Southwest. The Dutch briefly held New York, the city's former name being New Amsterdam. America became a chessboard for European empires. Wars fought in Europe spilled into the colonies. Indigenous nations were pulled into alliances, sometimes playing European powers against each other, sometimes crushed between them. The land was no longer just a place to live, it was a prize. By the early 1700s, slavery was fully entrenched. Laws defined Africans and their descendants as property. Skin colour became destiny. Plantations expanded across the South. Wealth flowed to Europe. Violence enforced the system. America was growing, but on stolen land, with stolen labour. And still settlers kept coming. By 1732, England had established 13 colonies. Each was different. Some were religious, some commercial, some dependent on slavery, some on trade and shipbuilding. But they shared one thing: they were no longer temporary. They were permanent societies with families, generations, and identities separate from Europe. And that separation would matter. Colonisation didn't end when settlements succeeded. Its effects are still here. Indigenous nations were displaced, broken, and forced onto reservations. Yet, they survived. African Americans endured centuries of slavery and segregation, yet resisted, endured, and reshaped the nation. The United States was born from colonization, but also from conflict, resistance, and contradiction. Freedom built on unfreedom, opportunity built on exclusion, a nation founded on ideals it did not live up to. The mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke reminds us that history could have gone differently, that colonization was never inevitable, and that America's story didn't begin with independence. It began with survival, struggle, and the cost of empire. But, of course, and importantly, we must remember that the settlers of Roanoke were not the first Europeans to reach and briefly settle on the continent of North America. That accolade must go to the Vikings, who in about the year 1021 AD established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Archaeological excavation carried out in the 1960s established Norse-style building foundations. Iron nails were also found at the site, which shows that skilled craftsmen used local resources to produce iron for nails that were used to repair ships. And indeed, the surrounding area provided ample resources such as timber, berries, and fish, which supported their short-lived community. This was a land that the Vikings called Vinland, the name meaning wineland or land of pastures. And these names appear in Icelandic sagas and refers to this area of coastal North America. The archaeologists think that the settlement was likely a temporary camp for repairs and gathering timber and other resources, not a lasting colony. But the significance is huge. This discovery established the first known European contact with the Americas, hundreds of years before anybody thought that Europeans settled in North America. We also know that the Vikings encountered the indigenous people of North America, whom they referred to as the Skraelings. These interactions, while sparse, provide a fascinating glimpse of two early cultures coming together in a new land. But if we really want to talk about colonisation of North America, the first true people to colonise this continent were indigenous groups who crossed from Asia thousands of years before the Vikings even. The earliest settlers arrived from Asia, likely via a land bridge, during the last ice age, spreading across the continent. There is evidence of human presence in New Mexico dating back 23,000 years. The White Sands footprints are evidence of people that pushes back the timeline of human presence in North America significantly. A well-known early culture, known as the Clovis people, used distinctive spear points and spread across North America from about 13,000 years ago. And indeed all Native American people living in North America today can trace their ancestry back to these very first settlers who traversed the Bering Land Bridge or Beringia over 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, migrating from the land that we now call Siberia. These are significant discoveries, and with the political situation in the United States as it is at the moment, there cannot be a more important time for the American people to understand, recognize, and indeed embrace the true cultural heritage of their continent. A continent that has a human history and culture stretching back thousands of years. Thanks for listening. Why not follow us at the M of H on Instagram or TikTok, or the Mysteries of History on Facebook. It's here that we'll post even more mysterious and historical content. So until next week, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.